the birth of modern Hawaii. Keauhou, the new era. The arrival of Captain Cook. With the arrival of Captain Cook at Kealakekua Bay on January 17, 1779, Hawaii became briefly known as the Sandwich Islands. Cook's arrival at Kealakekua Bay on the big ships with fluffy white sails harkened back to the ancient chants about the Hawaiian god Lono. Those songs said that Lono would return one day to Kealakekua Bay on a floating island. About 5 weeks after his arrival, Cook was given a test to see if he really was Lono, and when Cook failed that test, the consequences of his failure were catastrophic. That strange story about Cook's test synchronistically marks the beginning of modern Hawaii in some weird, sardonic kind of way. However, even though Cook's celebration of his failure to pass that test is fascinating, it doesn't really add anything of significance to what I'm about to say. But they did say Cook was delicious. So bon appétit, mon ami. A mere 40 years later, in 1819, Hawaii was now united into a kingdom. That year, the first king of Hawaii died, and the missionaries officially arrived a year later. These missionaries were the descendants of the Calvinist Puritans who had colonized New England in 1620. They had plans for Hawaii. Oh boy. Keauhou, the new era. A mere 40 years after Captain Cook's inauspicious arrival, the essence of Hawaiian culture had been completely and totally obliterated. Nothing much survived the westernization of Hawaii, except for a dwindling population of shell-shocked Kanakas. Up to that time, the Hawaiians had been living in an agrarian, Stone Age, utopian paradise. Now they found themselves reduced to wearing Western clothing and having jobs in some kind of Halley dystopian nightmare called the Sandwich Islands. And so henceforth, life in Hawaii became dominated by Caucasian haoles and their agendas. The most significant group of these common denominators were the American missionaries. The 1620 crew. As mentioned before, these missionaries were the descendants of the Plymouth Rock Puritans. These Caucasian haole missionaries and their progeny soon became involved in political intrigues that involved large landholdings and commerce. The second generation of these missionaries started turning the Hawaiian jungle into plantations to grow sugarcane, pineapples, and bananas in industrial quantities. In 1848, land reform became necessary in order to set up those plantations, because before that, no one except the monarch had owned land in Hawaii. The missionaries also married into the Hawaiian royal class, all of these being familiar 1620 tactical approaches to the conquest of the savages, pioneered by their ancestors some 200 years earlier. Their descendants still exercise significant political power in Hawaii today, along with the U.S. military et al. And the global agro-cultural corporations, the exact same powerful cartels as in 1893. Before the arrival of these missionaries, the Hawaiians had an oral culture. The missionaries began turning the Hawaiian oral language into a written, sanitized version of Hawaiian. That was done in order to indoctrinate the Hawaiians into their haole Christian cults. After literacy had destabilized the oral Hawaiian culture, in 1869 the authorities banned the use of that missionary Hawaiian language in the Hawaiian educational system, proving Marshall McLuhan right. The medium is the massage. This scholastic ban of Hawaiian caused a decline in the use of any remaining Hawaiian dialects, including the missionary version of Hawaiian, to the point of extinction. When the Hawaiian language was resuscitated in the 1960s, only the missionary-created written version was chosen for revival. The written Hawaiian of today and its vocabulary were created by the missionaries in the 1820s, based upon a variety of different Hawaiian dialects, and primarily for religious proselytation purposes. Today's version of Hawaiian might be comprehensible to Hawaiians who were living in the islands prior to 1778, but it would likely sound foreign to them. In modern Hawaii, not many people today can fluently speak the missionaries' version of Hawaiian, and instead, Hawaiian Creole Pidgin English and Standard American English are the lingua franca in today's Hawaii. The post-mortem. Exactly when the Kingdom of Hawaii died is hard to precisely date. That's because between the arrival of the missionaries in 1820 up to their takeover of Hawaii in 1893, there are so many good dates to choose from. However, the year 1860 is a good date to pick because that's the year the native Hawaiian population had declined to less than half of the 1800 census. About 60,000 Kanakas were still alive in 1860, and they were only about half the total population of Hawaii. That 50% death rate was devastating to the remaining Hawaiians who had survived that socio-political disaster. By 1860, the residual Hawaiian population was already a minority in their own islands. At the same time, the missionary haoles were co-opting their culture for nefarious purposes. January 17th, 1893, was the 114th anniversary of Cook's arrival at Kealakekua Bay. Cook was killed and eaten by the Hawaiians, or so it said, and exactly 114 years later, the Hawaiians were killed and eaten by Cook's distant relatives. What an odd coincidence! The takeover was organized by an elite group within the missionary party called the Committee of Safety. They controlled all aspects of the media, business, and politics in Hawaii. You can find the surnames of the Committee of Safety online. These surnames appear in Hawaii today and are still playing similar roles as in 1893. The missionary party's theft of the Kingdom of Hawaii was made possible with the help of the United States Marines. Sempra Fi Fi Fo Fum. By 1893, the U.S. had a large military presence on Oahu, the seat of government for the Hawaiian Kingdom. The native Hawaiians had become the proverbial frog in the slowly boiling pot. 100 years later, in 1993, President Bill Clinton signed an act of Congress apologizing for the U.S. role in the 1893 overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. Sorry we took your country. No, we won't give it back. However, today it is unclear to whom the U.S. could return the Kingdom of Hawaii. That's because there is no unified, publicly acknowledged Hawaiian Kingdom shadow government, and therefore no public entity to receive the return of the kingdom. The old ways give way to the new. The ancient Hawaiian way of living did not involve daily repetitive manual labor. Everyone had a role to play in society, but no one had a 12-hour-a-day, 6-day-a-week full-time job. They had lots of leisure time, and work was play. Hula was life. Therefore, the Hawaiians were not well adapted to this new way of plantation living. As a result of this maladaptation, the plantation owners were not able to obtain a reliable supply of slave labor. That was because the Hawaiians were dying, and some were being imprisoned on Molokai, and those that survived those clusterfucks were not interested in being plantation laborers. As the Hawaiians lay dying, the plantation owners were busy bringing in new sources of slave labor. These new workers would work 12 hours a day for 6 and even 7 days a week, and for slave wages too. About 20,000 Chinese were the first to arrive in Hawaii starting in 1850, which was shortly after the land reforms. The Chinese workers had 5-year contracts for $3 a month, plus travel, food, clothing, and housing. $3 then is about $75 a month in 2022. In 1878, people from the Azores began to arrive, and in about the same numbers. They were dubbed Portuguese. They brought the ukulele with them and came as paniolos, Hawaiian cowboys. The next large group arrived in 1885, starting with some 900 Japanese immigrants, and that number would grow to a much larger number in the ensuing years. By 1890, these three groups of foreign laborers, haoles, would be equal in size to the Hawaiian population, about 40,000 Kanaka and about 40,000 haole. This was the tipping point that enabled the Committee of Safety cabal to overthrow the kingdom in 1893. These three groups of laborers were followed in the 1930s by Ilocano-speaking Filipinos. Those four groups mixed and matched up with the dwindling Hawaiian population. The descendants of these groups make up the bulk of Hawaii's modern population, commonly known as locals among the non-local haoles in Hawaii today. Very modern Hawaii. There is a palpable tension among the locals in Hawaii today. Many born in modern Hawaii have a tendency to blame tourism and the incoming mainland haoles for their present difficulties. And there is some validity in their complaints too. However, the destruction of the Hawaiian way of living happened long before modern times. It's just that it keeps on happening. Some of the stories that follow in this section will highlight the persecution of the Hawaiians living in Kalalau Valley in 1893, and again in modern times between 2003 and 2004. And I admit that my telling about what happened to the Hawaiians in Kalalau Valley could be biased, but the evidence doesn't seem to disagree with me. Nonetheless, you might come to a different conclusion. The other stories in this section are about the very first Ranger Scratch game in 1893, and the modern Ranger Scratch game and how it's played in Kalalau Valley today. Those games and their outcomes hint at the reasons why the outlaws think the mana is everywhere.